when it comes to Obama's foreign policies, we're hearing a lot about the successes, especially on the campaign trail, the success of Libya, pulling troops out of Iraq, Osama bin Laden. How would you define his foreign policy over the past 4 years?
Well, let's go back to the bin Laden decision for a moment.
Yeah.
Announcing within hours of bin Laden's death that the arch-terrorist was dead was a strategic blunder of enormous proportions, because you gave away the most valuable thing in war, which is the element of surprise. Based on the flash drives and the documents that were captured in bin Laden's lair in Abbottabad, Pakistan, the technical services of the CIA and the military could have developed intelligence on the locations of other leading al-Qaeda figures, as well as government officials in Arab and other Muslim countries that are financing al-Qaeda. This would have been enormously beneficial. It could have led to swooping in with surprise on other people and really shutting down the bin Laden organization entirely. This could have been a turning point in the war on terror, and instead it was squandered. It was frittered away for a momentary bump in the polls.
Well, and now we're seeing in Afghanistan some instances of blue on green
yeah, Richard, I wondered
attacks.
if you could speak to this, because my brother is actually in Afghanistan at the moment, and I've viewed with concern the rising stories from the news media about the Guardian Angel program, and I wonder if you could explain a little bit about what's going on there to us.
Well, the Afghan National Army has been stood up in large numbers by the U.S., but it still contains some elements that are unfriendly to the United States. And we have to also remember that many people serving in the Afghan National Army, alongside U.S. troops in forward operating bases and around that country, have relatives in Pakistan which could be threatened. Some have also been paid to carry out attacks against Americans, allegedly by the ISI through various proxies, such as radical Islamic groups. And some just have an anti-foreigner mentality. But a lot of it is driven by financial, ideological, and fear for their families.
Shouldn't we be concerned that the Afghans are now basically saying we've got to watch everybody because we don't know who's who?
Well, it's a very tricky problem, because on the other hand, you need a certain equality and informality if you're going to operate jointly with somebody. And if you start segregating people, you end up with a very ineffective force. Also, it gets into the question of what equipment we can leave behind. If we leave behind advanced military equipment that could be later used against our forces, that could be a problem.
Well, I just want to play what a clip of President Obama, what he had to say about this rash of Afghan on Western forces. Go ahead.
Part of what's taking place is we are transitioning to Afghan security, and for us to train them effectively, we are in much closer contact. Our troops are in much closer contact with Afghan troops on an ongoing basis.
An explanation that is leading from behind on this issue?
You know, I find that explanation really pernicious, because it assumes that as the more time we spend in close contact with Afghans, the more dangerous they are to us, that familiarity breeds contempt. That's exactly the opposite the case. I mean, we ignore that 99% of Afghans have volunteered to serve in the Afghan National Army or in the police forces and have worked alongside Americans for years without harming them. Yes, there have been tragic cases, such as a colonel's T-boy who was turned assassin and so on, but they tend to fit a certain pattern. They have either relatives in Pakistan or have joined the Army recently. They haven't spent a lot of time with U.S. forces.
Do you think the drawdown, the date that's been set, but here's where I come from on this. I looked at this issue when I worked for the CIA, Afghanistan desk. That was some years ago. I had a very dim view of prospects, personally, of what was going to happen in Afghanistan. I worry that now the politics are driving this, and I don't hear Republicans saying that an artificial date at some point in time that we're going to come back from, maybe that's not the best option here. Maybe we should just accelerate the transition to the Afghans. That's what we're going to do anyway. We've been there a long time. It does not seem like the metrics we have set up for ourselves, they keep getting pushed back. I think it's time to bring everybody home from there, and I wonder why I don't hear really, very few Republicans are even willing to broach that as an issue.
I hear two separate things in your question. One is, exit dates are always a bad idea. Let's look at the Soviet experience. They announced that on January 1, 1989, that all the Russian regular army forces would be north of the Oxus River, and in fact, they kept to that date. But what happened in 1988, as you know well, the number of attacks increased in that year, even though the Russians were in the middle of a transition out and their date was announced publicly and repeatedly and globally. Why? Because everyone who remained wanted to take credit and control after the Soviet exit. So it actually increased the violence. So I think setting these exit dates is a dangerous and bad idea as a matter of strategy.
But aren't you then hoping for an exit date will come at some point when they won't be shooting at you on the way out?
Like
and I don't think that day is coming.
Like victories are best when done by surprise and in secrecy. so should drawdown dates. Now, the other point that you're making is that eventually we're going to have to transition out. And the question is who ends up running Afghanistan? If it's Pakistan and it's radical Islamic proxies, that's an enormous problem for the United States, and Afghanistan could in the future become a threat to us once again and portend a future 9/11. So, and the idea of establishing a Jeffersonian democracy, which I think no serious person really thought would happen,